For today's class, we are going to spend some time talking about the self-portraits of Frida Kahlo, in particular how she used traditional Mexican folk religious art, the Ex-voto and the Retablo, to develop her understanding of art and how it can be used to transform and transcend suffering on a human plane. Frida Kahlo, many people are aware of, suffered serious health issues, particularly after her accident that shattered her pelvis and damaged her spine. She was also afflicted by polio when she was quite young. People also spend quite a bit of time on her relationship with famous muralist Iago Rivera, but again, this sort of undermines her role as an artist in her own right. So today we're going to look at her self-portraits and how she developed them from her understanding of folk religious art in Mexico. Kahlo was also a trained artist. While she did not go to art school, she did learn a great deal from her father, who was a famous professional photographer. And her father set her up with an apprenticeship with his friend, who was a professional engraver. So she learned composition, she learned technique, she learned the skills that are required to compose an effective image, no matter what your media is. So as you can see in the self-portrait, she surrounds herself with some very specific symbols, some very specific iconography. And again, this is something we're going to spend quite a bit of time thinking about in today's lecture. We're also going to remind ourselves about how art is made, and that we make, as a very famous art critic said, we make the future out of fragments of the past. And artists are no different. They use the past and past traditions to create contemporary art. So we're also going to think about what is art, and we're going to ignore where it says write a 1-minute essay. We're going to think strongly about that. We're going to recall that art comes from the Greek word ars, which means skill, and it also comes from this word techne, which means technique. And again, Kahlo is making her art out of a tradition and an awareness and knowledge of skill and technique. We're also going to remind ourselves that art is about asking questions, about imagining the impossible and imagining the improbable. And to do both, one must know what's possible and what is probable. The two types of folk art we're going to look at in specific in relationship to Kahlo, one is the Retablo. The Retablo literally means behind the altar. And this is a type of artwork that can be found in Europe and in Mexico. And it's very specific. I'm going to show you an example now. This is an example, and as you can see, there's a detailed architectural frame, and that framework surrounds figures, religious figures from primarily the New Testament, because this type of art is traditionally found in a Catholic church. So more specifically, the Retablo is about religious images, either paintings or as sculpture. It's unified by some sort of architectural frame. It decorates the back of the main altar. Remember, Retablo literally means behind the altar. It's either painted on wood or on canvas. Here it is again, so to reinforce that understanding. Now, in Mexico, the Mexican Retablo is a bit different. It does not stand behind the altar. Instead, these are small oil paintings, often of a single saint, the Virgin Mary, or a Christ figure. And they come in three forms. They're either painted images on canvas, they're saints that are painted on tin, or they're plates, meaning they're unframed sort of canvases. In art, as we'll discuss later, what we call the canvas, the technical word is support. So you can paint on a variety of materials, tin, canvas, and wood, etc. These are all called the support. So this is an example of a Mexican retablo. And in this Mexican retablo, this Christ figure, as you can see, the emphasis is on suffering. It's on how human and divine redemption can redeem the soul that is suffering. These Mexican retablos are often made of tin sheets, and they're destined for home altars, the ones made of tin sheets in particular. They're small and they're lightweight images, often done by amateur artists. A very specific type of Mexican retablo is sometimes called the ex-voto, or retablos ex-votos. In this, there's some miraculous cure of an ill individual, and that could be a physical illness, an accident, an imprisonment, or some other dire circumstance, like perhaps a murder. This is a specific form of art making that tells a different story and has a different meaning. So in the ex-voto, or the retablos ex-votos, they're all constructed the same way. They're composed with 3 different realms, and I'll show you an example in a minute. In the middle is the reality, and that's the ill person or the person in some sort of dire circumstance. In the upper is the spiritual world, the supernatural world, and there you will see one or more sacred people, a saint, a Christ figure, or Mary, who is responsible for the healing of the suffering person. And below, in a written text, it explains the illness and the cure through this divine intervention. So this is the ex-voto, or the retablos ex-votos. This is an example. So you can see on your right the ill person in a bed. And to your left, you can see a Christ figure and Mary interceding into this illness, and below a description of the actual experience. These were often painted by someone in the family who had witnessed this experience, and they're kept not to remember it, but to use it to recall and strengthen their faith and belief in this intervention. These are quite small pieces, these ex-votos. So they really flourished in the 19th and 20th century in rural Mexico. Frida Kahlo, over her lifetime, collected a number of these pieces, and her whole home was surrounded with these. Artists look at other art, they surround them with art, not for inspiration alone, but also to study and to learn. These ex-votos and these Mexican retablos, often done by untrained artists, they have a very specific directness. They're very emotional. They use forms and colors in a dramatic way to encourage that sort of direct emotion. That's something you need to look for in Kahlo's work, how she uses these devices. So here's an example of how she actually used these. We're going to compare to her work to one of these Mexican ex-votos. So this one is called Behold a Man. We've seen this before. So if you take a minute to look at it, you might observe certain things about it. It's very emotional, it has strong colors, it's very direct in its imagery, and it's quite small. This is her image that she uses from the other. And if you look at it carefully right now, and I'll give you some time, make a list of what you recall in the previous image without going back to the image. What is strikingly similar? What do you notice? This image is not painted on tin, it's painted on canvas, but again, this is quite small, right? 28 inches, imperial method, right, by 20. So a little over 2 feet by 1.5 feet. So this is quite a small piece. A bit bigger than the usual retablo, but still. So take a few minutes. What do you remember about the previous image that's similar to this one? Right? Okay, great. So the first thing that we notice is that these are both isolated figures. There's nobody else in the composition. And behind them is a very cloudy background. That kind of cloudy background is really quite moody. And again, this isolated figure, the sense of being alone, is worth noting. Secondly, that's important to remember here is that Frida Kahlo, and we'll talk about this in a minute, well, while she used some religious imagery from Catholicism, she was also very interested in her Mexican background, and particularly Aztec imagery. And then in Aztec culture, we have to remember that a person is not one who's completely free agent, such as we have in the West. They believe there was a relationship between the person and animals and plants and natural and supernatural phenomenon. You'll see this in most quote unquote non-Western cultures. There's no division between what is conscious and what is unconscious. It's very fluid back and forth. There are no divisions in non-Western culture. There are divisions in Western culture. So how she broaches both these Catholic Western traditions with a non-Western approach in this painting is worth noting. The other thing to remember is that Aztec imagery was a source of purity and honor in post-revolutionary consciousness in Mexico. And in particular, the sense there was a mystical, supernatural force that united life and death. So again, we're going to think about this in context of the Kahlo self-portrait. So back to these two images. You will see a like position in both the arms and the hands. This crossing figure, how this Christ figure who is being crucified has been bound. And in the other image, you can see that she crosses her arms, although while she is not bound, there is still that recollection of being bound the way that this Christ figure is. Thirdly, look at their facial expressions. They're both very stoic. There's a certain acceptance of suffering and pain. That word is missing, pain. They're not joyous, but they are accepting. Very stoic, very similar, very direct. Likewise, she replicates this knotted cord. Here it becomes a golden necklace in terms of illustration and storytelling. The knot on the left becomes a stone at the neck, right? A further sense of being constricted or tied down that are similar iconography. What is different? Well, the image on the left is a very dark sky. And on the right, however, is a light and cloudy sky. And again, we have to think back to this Aztec tradition. If you change the color and that meaning, it opens up possibility. Whether you're isolated, you're lone, and you're stoic, but that cloudy sky also perhaps suggests infinity, possibility. The dog, too. Kahlo loved animals and surrounded herself with animals, but this particular dog, this is the dog that is the guide to the soul in the underworld in Aztec culture. That may seem like an obvious symbolism, especially when you compare it to the strong Catholic imagery on the left, but she's marrying the two of them together, offering both of these possibilities, thinking about both how religion can redeem people, how her own belief system, the Aztec belief system, can redeem people by eliminating those boundaries, and then presenting it all as a piece of art, and how the artist can do that is, I believe, the implication. And that's something you can argue about in the short answer essay on your quiz.